The story of Leo Tolstoy's metamorphosis from a celebrated novelist to a restless spiritual seeker reads like a novel itself, full of triumph, doubt, confrontation, and quiet revelation. Imagine a man who had already carved his name into the annals of world literature with two towering epics, War and Peace and Anna Karenina, standing on the pinnacle of artistic fame, yet feeling an emptiness that no applause could fill. How does one reconcile the applause of the crowd with the silence of the soul? In the years that followed the publication of those masterpieces, Tolstoy embarked on a journey that would reshape not only his own life, but also the moral imagination of Russia and the wider world. Tolstoy was born into the privileged world of the Russian aristocracy on September 9, 1828, at Yasnaya Polyana, a sprawling estate that would later become the crucible of his literary imagination. His parents, Count Nikolai Ilyich Tolstoy and Countess Maria Nikolaevna, were members of the landed gentry, steeped in the traditions of the Orthodox Church, yet their household was marked by a certain laxity. The young Lev, his baptismal name, was raised amidst a paradox, the grandeur of noble privilege and the stark reality of serf labor that sustained it. He learned to ride, to hunt, and to fence, but also to watch the peasants toil in the fields, to hear the distant chants of the church bells that rose above the endless Russian plains. This dual exposure planted the first seeds of a consciousness that would later be torn between the comforts of aristocratic life and the moral weight of the suffering he could not ignore. When Tolstoy entered university in Kazan, he was already a prodigious writer, but his studies were cut short by his father's death in 1847. He inherited the family estate, and with it, the responsibilities of a landowner. Yet the early years of his adulthood were marked by a restless energy that drove him to the army, to travel across Europe, and to indulge in the pleasures of high society. He married Sofia Andreevna Burz, a woman of modest means but extraordinary intellect, in 1862. Their union, while passionate, was also a partnership of ideas. Sofia, herself a voracious reader, encouraged Tolstoy's literary ambitions, and together they raised 13 children amidst a household that was both a literary salon and a bustling farm. By the time War and Peace emerged in 1869, Tolstoy had already begun to question the meaning of his own existence. The novel, with its sweeping panorama of Napoleon's invasion of Russia, seemed to suggest that history is driven by the invisible currents of countless human wills. Yet the very act of chronicling such vast human drama left Told a lingering sense of futility. After Anna Karenina appeared in 1877, a work that dissected the moral decay of the Russian aristocracy through the tragic fate of its heroine, Tolstoy found himself standing at a crossroads. He had achieved what most writers could only dream of: universal acclaim, financial security, and a place in the cultural pantheon. Yet, as he later confessed in his own diary, a profound inner void persisted. It was in the winter of 1870, at the age of 42, that the first fissures in his spiritual armor became unmistakable. He began to experience what he later termed the crisis of consciousness, a period of sleepless nights, relentless introspection, and an acute awareness of the moral contradictions of his own life. He wrote in his diary on March 23, 1870, "I have lived my whole life as if I were a character in a novel, performing my role, yet I have never asked myself why I am here, what purpose I serve beyond the page." This entry, raw and unadorned, captures the moment when the great novelist turned his gaze inward, confronting the very questions that had animated his fictional heroes. The crisis was not an isolated, personal melancholy. It was deeply intertwined with the religious and philosophical currents of his time. The Russian Orthodox Church, with its emphasis on confession, repentance, and the mystical experience of divine love, offered a framework for spiritual renewal. Yet Tolstoy found the institutional church wanting. He perceived a gap between the lofty ideals of Christ's teachings and the complacent rituals of the clergy. In the same diary, a month later, he wrote, "The church teaches love, yet its priests sit on thrones of power, turning the gospel into a tool of the state." This tension would later fuel his outspoken criticism of ecclesiastical authority. At the same time, Tolstoy was absorbing the ideas of Western philosophers who challenged the foundations of modern thought. Arthur Schopenhauer's doctrine of the will, which posited that human desire is the root of suffering, resonated with Tolstoy's own sense of existential dread. He noted in a marginal note on a copy of The World as will and representation. If the will is the source of all pain, then to deny the will is to find peace. Immanuel Kant's moral philosophy, especially the categorical imperative, acting only according to that maxim which one can will to become a universal law, provided Tolstoy with an ethical compass that seemed to transcend the particularities of Russian social hierarchy. He later reflected, Kant's insistence that morality must be grounded in reason alone offers a path away from the arbitrary authority of princes and priests. These Western influences did not replace his orthodox roots. Rather, they fused with them, creating a hybrid spiritual outlook that would later be labeled Tolstoyan Christianity. One concrete illustration of this synthesis appears in a diary entry dated February 12, 1873, a year after his crisis had deepened. He writes, "I have read Kant and Schopenhauer, and I see in them a mirror of my own struggle. I must live as if every action were a confession before God, not before the court or the crowd." In this brief but potent line, Tolstoy articulates his emerging belief that personal morality must be internal, not imposed by external institutions. He resolves to strip away the superfluous trappings of his aristocratic life, to live simply, to work the land with his own hands, and to seek a direct, unmediated relationship with the divine. His correspondence with his wife Sophia provides another window into his evolving mindset. In a letter dated August 8, 1873, he confided, "My dear Sophia, I feel as though I have been living a lie. The comforts of our estate, the pleasures of society, all seem like a theater in which I play a role I no longer recognize. I must find a way to align my life with the teachings of Christ, to love my neighbor not as a distant ideal, but as a daily practice." Sophia's reply, though compassionate, was tinged with apprehension. "Leo, I understand your yearning, but I fear the world will not accept a man who renounces his birthright. Yet I see the sincerity in your eyes, and I will stand by you, even if the path leads us into hardship." Their exchange captures the personal cost of Tolstoy's spiritual awakening, as well as the supportive partnership that would sustain him through the turbulence to come. The year 1870 also brought an encounter that would leave an indelible mark on Tolstoy's spiritual trajectory: his meeting with the mystic philosopher Vladimir Solovyov. Solovyov, a towering figure in Russian religious thought, advocated for a godmanhood that united the divine and human natures. In a private conversation held at the Tolstoy estate, Solovyov urged Tolstoy to consider the possibility that humanity could become a conduit for divine love. Tolstoy, ever the skeptic, responded, "I am drawn to the idea that love is the ultimate law, yet I see in the world a law that is often twisted by power." Solovyov's reply was both poetic and challenging. "Love, dear Lev, is not a sentiment to be whispered in private chambers. It must be lived in the streets, in the suffering, in the very soil beneath our feet." This dialogue, though brief, illuminated the tension between Tolstoy's rationalist leanings and the mystical aspirations that would later surface in his later works, such as The Kingdom of God is Within You. Tolstoy's crisis reached a public crescendo in 1877 when he published A Confession, a stark, autobiographical treatise that laid bare his spiritual turmoil. The work was met with both admiration and hostility. The Russian government, wary of any text that might undermine the established order, summoned Tolstoy before a censorship board. The ensuing public debate, held in the Grand Hall of the Ministry of Education, pitted Tolstoy's existential confession against the state's insistence on maintaining social cohesion. In the debate, a senior official declared, "Mr. Tolstoy, your personal crisis cannot become a weapon against the stability of the nation." Tolstoy, calm yet resolute, answered, "If my inner crisis reveals the hollowness of our collective moral pretenses, then perhaps it is my duty to voice it." The exchange was reported in contemporary newspapers, and it cemented Tolstoy's reputation as a moral dissenter, willing to risk his standing for the sake of spiritual truth. The reaction to Tolstoy's turn was far from monolithic. Contemporary critics, such as the literary journalist Nikolai Strakhov, dismissed his spiritual quest as a form of escapism. Strakhov wrote in the Russian Messenger, "Tolstoy, once a master of the human drama, now retreats into a private world of mysticism, abandoning his social responsibilities. His newfound piety is but a refuge from the challenges of modern life." Strakhov's critique suggested that Tolstoy's spiritual pursuits were a withdrawal from the real world, a way to avoid confronting the complexities of Russian society. In stark contrast, modern scholars like James H. Billington argue that Tolstoy's crisis was a genuine ethical awakening, a radical reorientation that prefigured later nonviolent movements. Billington notes, "Tolstoy's insistence on living according to the teachings of Christ, without the mediation of church or state, represents one of the earliest articulations of a principled, nonviolent resistance that would later inspire Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr." This scholarly debate underscores the enduring relevance of Tolstoy's early crisis, inviting us to consider whether his transformation was a personal indulgence or a profound moral revolution. To understand the depth of Tolstoy's inner struggle, it helps to draw an analogy with the myth of Sisyphus. Like Sisyphus, who is condemned to roll a boulder up an endless hill, Tolstoy seemed trapped in a cycle of literary achievement that offered no lasting satisfaction. Yet, unlike the mythic figure who resigns to absurdity, Tolstoy chose to confront the hill's base, to question the very nature of the stone he was pushing. In doing so, he sought a new kind of meaning, one that was not measured by external accolades but by the authenticity of his daily actions. This shift mirrors the existential angst articulated by Soren Kierkegaard, who wrote of the dizziness of freedom that arises when the individual confronts the abyss of choice. Kierkegaard's concept of the leap of faith, the moment when one embraces belief without rational proof, resonates with Tolstoy's decision to abandon his aristocratic comforts and to live a life guided solely by his interpretation of Christ's teachings. Tolstoy's journey also intersects intriguingly with the ideas of Peter Kropotkin, the Russian anarchist who championed mutual aid as a natural law of cooperation. While Kropotkin advocated for a stateless society built on voluntary cooperation, Tolstoy envisioned a Christian anarchism rooted in love and nonviolence. Both thinkers, though arriving from opposite ideological poles, shared a common critique of state authority and a belief in the transformative power of communal solidarity. Tolstoy's later writings, such as his essay, "The Kingdom of God is Within You," echo Kropotkin's call for a society where individuals act out of love rather than coercion. This convergence suggests that Tolstoy's early crisis was not an isolated spiritual episode, but part of a broader intellectual ferment that questioned the legitimacy of power structures in late 19th century Russia. Returning to the concrete, let us examine the diary entry of 1873 in greater detail. In it, Tolstoy writes, "I have read Kant and Schopenhauer, and I see in them a mirror of my own struggle. I must live as if every action were a confession before God, not before the court or the crowd." Notice the triadic structure: Kant, Schopenhauer, God. He is weaving together the rationalist ethic of Kant, the pessimistic will of Schopenhauer, and the Christian imperative of confession. This synthesis is not a mere intellectual exercise, it is a lived philosophy. He resolved to work the fields, to feed the serfs, to abandon the luxuries of his estate. In a later entry dated May 9, 1874, he records, "Today I cut firewood with my own hands. The axe sang, the sweat ran down my brow, and for a brief moment I felt the presence of the divine in the rhythm of labor." Here, the mundane act of chopping wood becomes a sacramental experience, a microcosm of his larger theological project. To sanctify everyday labor as a path to spiritual purity. Sophia's letters, meanwhile, provide an intimate counterpoint to Tolstoy's public declarations. In a missive dated September 15, 1873, she writes, "Your yearning for truth is beautiful, but I fear the world will not understand a man who gives up his birthright for the sake of a quiet conscience. Yet I see the light in your eyes, and I will stand by you, even if it means we must endure poverty." Her words reveal the personal stakes of Tolstoy's crisis. The potential loss of social status, the threat of financial ruin, the strain on family life. Yet they also underscore a partnership grounded in mutual respect and shared moral aspiration. Sophia herself became a conduit for Tolstoy's ideas, translating his later works into French and English, ensuring that his spiritual message reached a global audience. The 1870 meeting with Vladimir Solovyov, though brief, offers a vivid anecdote that illustrates the intellectual cross-pollination of the era. Solovyov, known for his poetic theology, recited a passage from his own work, The Justification of the Good. "The soul that loves is the soul that becomes God." He turned to Tolstoy and said, "Your novels have already shown you the suffering of humanity. Now let your heart become the vessel of divine love." Tolstoy, ever the realist, replied, "I can write about suffering, but can I live it?" The exchange, recorded by a servant in the household journal, encapsulated the tension between artistic representation and lived experience, a tension that would drive Tolstoy to abandon the pen for the plow, at least for a time. The public debate of 1877 over a confession serves as another dramatic episode. When the censorship board demanded that Tolstoy retract passages that criticized the church's complicity with the state, he responded not with legal arguments but with a moral appeal. "If the truth of my soul is denied, then the truth of your institution is also denied." The debate was televised in the newspapers, and a satirical cartoon depicted Tolstoy as a lone shepherd standing against a towering, armored bear labeled the state. The image captured the public imagination, turning Tolstoy into a symbol of moral resistance. Yet it also invited fierce backlash. The conservative newspaper Moskovske Vedomosti warned, "Tolstoy's revolt is a dangerous precedent. If every intellectual follows his path, the fabric of Russian society will unravel." This criticism echoed the earlier accusations of escapism, suggesting that Tolstoy's personal crisis threatened the collective order. To assess whether Tolstoy's turn was escapism or genuine awakening, we must consider the broader historical context. The 1860s and 1870s were a period of profound social upheaval in Russia. The emancipation of the serfs in 1861 had created a new class of peasantry, but the reforms were half-hearted, leaving many peasants impoverished and disillusioned. Industrialization was nascent, and the intelligentsia grappled with Western ideas of liberalism, socialism, and nihilism. In this volatile environment, a figure of Tolstoy's stature publicly renouncing his wealth and critiquing both church and state was a radical act. It was not a retreat into private mysticism, but a public declaration that personal morality could not be divorced from social responsibility. As James H. Billington notes, Tolstoy's early crisis prefigured a form of civil disobedience that would later become a cornerstone of nonviolent resistance movements worldwide. This perspective aligns Tolstoy with later thinkers like Mahatma Gandhi, who famously called A Confession the most powerful book I have ever read, crediting it with shaping his own philosophy of satyagraha. Yet we must also acknowledge the counterargument presented by contemporary critics like Strakhov. They argued that Tolstoy's withdrawal from his aristocratic duties, selling his estates, refusing to serve in the military, and encouraging peasants to reject the authority of the church could be seen as an abdication of responsibility. From this angle, Tolstoy's spiritual quest might be interpreted as a form of aristocratic escapism, a way to avoid the messy politics of reform by retreating into personal piety. However, Tolstoy's own writings suggest a different motivation. In a letter to a friend dated December 1, 1876, he wrote, "I cannot stand idle while my fellow men suffer. If my conscience tells me that I must act, even if it means losing my title, I will do so without hesitation." This statement reveals an ethic that places moral duty above social privilege, a hallmark of genuine ethical awakening. The interplay between Tolstoy's personal crisis and the philosophical ideas of his time can be further illuminated by cross-referencing Kierkegaard's concept of existential angst. Kierkegaardian angst arises when the individual confronts the boundless possibilities of freedom and the weight of responsibility that accompanies it. Tolstoy, after achieving literary fame, faced a similar abyss. The freedom to continue as a celebrated author, or the responsibility to align his life with a higher moral law. In his diary of 1873, Tolstoy writes, "I stand at a crossroads, the road behind me paved with gold, the road ahead shrouded in humility. Which path shall I choose?" This mirrors Kierkegaard's famous question. Do you have the courage to become a self? The answer for Tolstoy was to become a self defined not by external accolades but by internal conviction. Similarly, the notion of Christian anarchism, as articulated later by Peter Kropotkin, finds an early echo in Tolstoy's critique of state and church authority. Kropotkin, in his essay Anarchist Communism, argued that true freedom arises from voluntary cooperation, not coercive governance. Tolstoy, in A Confession, declared, "The state is an institution that stands in the way of the kingdom of God, for it imposes law where love should be the only law." Both thinkers envision a society where moral law supersedes civil law, a radical reimagining of social order. While Kropotkin emphasized economic cooperation, Tolstoy emphasized spiritual love, yet both converge on the principle that authority must be rooted in ethical legitimacy, not in coercive power. The historical anecdotes of Solovyov's mystic invitation and the 1877 debate serve not merely as colorful footnotes, but as pivotal moments that crystallized Tolstoy's transformation. Solovyov's poetic exhortation, "Love is not a sentiment to be whispered in private chambers, it must be lived in the streets," foreshadowed Tolstoy's later insistence on practicing love through simple, everyday deeds. The public debate, with its stark juxtaposition of state authority and individual conscience, demonstrated that Tolstoy's crisis was not confined to private rumination. It erupted onto the public stage, challenging the very foundations of Russian civil society. To bring this exploration into the present, consider two contemporary examples that echo Tolstoy's early crisis. First, the modern movement of simple living advocates who reject consumerist excess in favor of sustainable, community-oriented lifestyles can trace an intellectual lineage to Tolstoy's own decision to give up his aristocratic comforts and work the land. When a family today chooses to downsize, grow their own food, and volunteer in local charities, they are, in a sense, reenacting Tolstoy's experiment of aligning daily labor with moral conviction. Second, the resurgence of interest in nonviolent protest exemplified by climate activists who stage sit-ins and civil disobedience, mirrors Tolstoy's belief that moral truth must be lived, even at the cost of legal repercussions. These modern parallels illustrate that Tolstoy's early crisis continues to reverberate, offering a template for individuals seeking to reconcile personal integrity with societal engagement. In sum, the early crisis of Leo Tolstoy, after the triumph of war and Peace and Anna Karenina, was a profound turning point that reshaped his identity from literary titan to spiritual seeker. His aristocratic upbringing provided both the material means and the moral contradictions that fueled his introspection. The years 1870-71 marked a period of sleepless contemplation, during which he grappled with the teachings of Russian orthodoxy, the pessimism of Schopenhauer, and the rational morality of Kant. Concrete evidence of his transformation appears in his 1873 diary entry, where he resolves to live as if each action were a confession before God, and in his heartfelt correspondence with Sophia, where he confesses the emptiness of his former life and the desire to align with Christ's love. Historical anecdotes, the mystic encounter with Vladimir Solovyov in 1870, and the public debate over a confession in 1877, illustrate how his inner turmoil spilled into the public sphere, challenging both church and state. Contemporary critics dismissed his turn as escapism, accusing him of retreating into a private realm of mysticism. Modern scholars, however, recognize his crisis as a genuine ethical awakening that anticipated later movements of nonviolent resistance and Christian anarchism. By cross-referencing Kierkegaard's existential angst and Kropotkin's vision of cooperative freedom, we see that Tolstoy's journey was part of a broader intellectual current questioning authority, meaning, and the role of the individual in society. The legacy of Tolstoy's early crisis reminds us that true transformation often begins with a quiet, sleepless night of doubt, followed by the courage to live out one's convictions in the ordinary acts of daily life. As Tolstoy himself wrote in his diary, the greatest battle is not fought on the fields of war, but within the heart of the man who dares to ask, "What is my purpose?" In reflecting on his path, from the glitter of literary fame to the humble rhythm of the plow, we are invited to consider our own moments of crisis, our own choices between comfort and conscience, and the possibility that, like Tolstoy, we too might find a deeper, more authentic way of being in the world. It is perhaps one of the most striking paradoxes of modern thought that a man who once commanded armies, who sat at the head of a sprawling aristocratic estate, could later become a pilgrim of conscience, wandering the fields of Russia with a Bible in one hand and a notebook in the other. When we speak of Leo Tolstoy's moral core, of his doctrine of nonviolence, his insistence that love is the universal law, and his relentless return to the Sermon on the Mount, we are not merely recounting the evolution of a literary genius, but tracing a path that would bend the very arc of history toward a different kind of power, a power that does not crush but convinces, that does not dominate but transforms. Tolstoy's encounter with the gospel was not a sudden conversion, but a long, grinding excavation of his own soul. As a young man, he had read the Bible in school, but the words of Christ had seemed distant, ornamental, a cultural relic rather than a living command. It was only after the death of his wife, Sophia, and the disintegration of his aristocratic world that he turned, almost in desperation, to the very text that had been relegated to the background of his upbringing. In 1884, he published The Kingdom of God is Within You, a work that would become both a manifesto and a crucible for his new ethic. In its opening pages he writes, "The Christian in the true sense is a man who loves his neighbor as himself, who does not think of himself as an end but as a means for the salvation of all." This simple sentence, repeated like a mantra throughout the book, is the heartbeat of his moral philosophy. The central claim of the kingdom is that the teachings of Jesus, especially those found in the Sermon on the Mount, are not merely spiritual advice for personal piety, but a radical political program. Tolstoy reads the Beatitudes not as metaphors but as literal imperatives. "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth," becomes a call for the dismantling of coercive power structures. "You have heard that it was said, but I say to you," is, for Tolstoy, a direct challenge to the state's claim to legitimacy. He argues that the kingdom of God is not an otherworldly promise, but a present reality that can be realized only when humanity lives in accordance with the law of love, a law that is universal, immutable, and crucially, non-violent. To understand how Tolstoy arrived at this conclusion, we must examine his interpretation of the doctrine of non-resistance to evil, a principle that he derived from Christ's command to turn the other cheek. In the Gospel, the act of turning the cheek is not a passive acceptance of humiliation, but an active refusal to perpetuate the cycle of violence. Tolstoyan non-resistance, therefore, is not a call for cowardice, but a deliberate, conscious choice to meet aggression with moral force. He writes, "If one does not resist evil, it cannot grow. It withers as a plant deprived of water." The metaphor of the plant is apt. Just as a garden can be starved of nourishment, so too can the machinery of oppression be starved of the moral justification that sustains it. Tolstoy's doctrine of love as universal law follows naturally from this. In his view, love is not a sentimental feeling, but an objective, universal principle that governs all ethical relations. He famously declares, "Love is the only law that can be universal, because it is the only law that does not discriminate." For Tolstoy, the law of love supersedes any legal or political code. The state, with its edicts and taxes, becomes illegitimate the moment it demands obedience that contradicts the command to love one's neighbor. This is why he famously refused to pay the taxes that funded the war against the Ottoman Empire in 1900. He wrote to the tax collector, "I cannot, in good conscience, contribute to the murder of my fellow men. The state's claim to my money is void the moment it uses it to kill." That single act of civil disobedience was not merely a protest against a particular war, but an embodiment of the principle that the state's authority is contingent upon its moral alignment with love. The moral critique does not stop at politics. In What is Art, Tolstoy turns his gaze toward culture, arguing that true art must serve the moral purpose of uplifting humanity, not merely pleasing the senses. He contends that art that glorifies war, that celebrates the heroics of conquest, is a betrayal of the law of love. He writes, "Art that does not awaken the conscience is dead art." It is a weapon, not a bridge. By extending his ethical scrutiny to the realm of aesthetics, Tolstoy demonstrates the pervasiveness of his moral vision. Every human activity, whether it be the drafting of a law or the composition of a symphony, must be measured against the yardstick of love. The influence of this vision reached far beyond the borders of Russia. In 1908, a young Mohandas K. Gandhi traveled to London to attend a conference, and there he met Tolstoy, then an elderly man whose frail body was a stark contrast to the vigor of his ideas. Their meeting, recorded in Gandhi's own diary, was brief but profound. Gandhi wrote, "I have read Tolstoy's Kingdom and felt a stirring in my heart." To meet him in person, to hear his voice, was like hearing the echo of a distant yet familiar prayer. Tolstoy, in turn, praised Gandhi's commitment to satyagraha, calling it the living embodiment of the law of love, a non-violent resistance that shakes the foundations of oppression without the need for blood. This exchange did more than inspire Gandhi. It provided a philosophical framework that would shape the Indian independence movement and later civil rights struggles across the globe. Yet, Tolstoy's ideas were not without fierce opposition. The Russian authorities, alarmed by the subversive potential of the kingdom, banned the book the same year it was published. The ban was not merely a bureaucratic act, it became a symbol of the state's fear of moral dissent. The anecdote of the banned book is illustrative. A copy was smuggled into a Siberian prison, where a political prisoner, reading by a candle, whispered the passage about turning the other cheek to his fellow inmates. The word spread like a quiet fire, igniting a network of conscientious objectors who refused conscription. This anecdote demonstrates how a single text, suppressed by power, can become a seed of resistance when it resonates with the deep yearning for moral integrity. The second anecdote, more intimate, concerns Tolstoy's own family. After publishing The Kingdom, his wife, Sofia, who had been his steadfast companion, confronted him about the practical implications of his doctrine. She asked, "If we cannot defend our home, what will become of our children?" Tolstoy's reply, recorded in his correspondence, was both tender and uncompromising. "The children will inherit a world where love is the law, not fear. If we teach them to use force, we teach them to betray their own souls." This personal dialogue reveals the inner tension between idealism and lived reality, a tension that would haunt Tolstoy until his death. The practical implications of Tolstoy's nonviolence have been examined and contested by scholars for decades. One major counterargument asks whether absolute nonviolence can ever be effective in the face of brutal oppression. Critics point to historical moments such as the Holocaust, the Rwandan genocide, or the brutal repression of the Khmer Rouge, where non-violent protests seemed insufficient to halt mass murder. They argue that in such extreme cases, the moral imperative to protect innocent lives may demand forceful intervention. Tolstoy himself anticipated this criticism, acknowledging that love does not deny the existence of evil, but insists that evil can be overcome only through love's transformative power, not through its mirror. He wrote, "Violence is the language of the weak, love is the language of the strong, because it does not break but heals." The question remains, however, whether love alone can dismantle the machinery of industrialized killing. A second line of criticism comes from Marxist thinkers who accuse Tolstoy of moral absolutism that neglects material conditions. They argue that his focus on individual conscience sidesteps the structural forces, class exploitation, economic exploitation, the state's monopoly on violence that generate suffering. In a 1915 essay, the Marxist philosopher Georgy Plekhanov wrote, "Tolstoy's pacifism is a bourgeois fantasy, a retreat into the private sphere that leaves the proletariat's struggle untouched." Tolstoy's response, found in a later essay, was to assert that the true revolution is not the seizure of the state, but the revolution of the heart. He believed that any external change without an internal transformation would be hollow. Yet this raises the question, can a heart-centered revolution sustain itself without addressing the material injustices that shape everyday life? To explore these counterarguments further, let us turn to the modern landscape of nonviolent movements. The civil rights movement in the United States, led by Martin Luther King Jr., explicitly drew on Tolstoy's Kingdom as a source of moral guidance. King's famous letter from Birmingham jail echoes Tolstoyan language. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, and he cites the principle of nonviolent direct action as a way to create a tension that forces a community to confront the issue. Yet King also faced criticism from more radical voices, such as Malcolm X, who argued that nonviolence could be a tool of the oppressor, a way to keep the oppressed passive. This mirrors the earlier Marxist critique, suggesting that the tension between moral purity and material urgency remains alive. In the contemporary era, movements such as Extinction Rebellion and the climate justice protests have embraced nonviolent civil disobedience as a strategic method. They invoke the law of love not only toward fellow humans but toward the planet itself, expanding Tolstoy's universal love to include all of creation. Their tactics, blocking roads, occupying public squares, refusing to comply with polluting policies, are reminiscent of Tolstoy's tax refusal, a small act that, when multiplied, creates a ripple effect. Yet these movements also confront the same practical challenges: how to sustain nonviolent discipline in the face of state repression, how to avoid co-optation, and how to translate moral outrage into concrete policy change. Analogies can help illuminate the subtle dynamics of Tolstoy's doctrine. Imagine a river that encounters a massive boulder. The water does not crash into the stone with force, but it flows around it, gradually eroding its edges until the obstacle is no longer an impediment. Similarly, nonviolent love does not confront oppression with a hammer, but with a steady, persistent current that reshapes the landscape over time. Another analogy is that of a mirror. When an aggressor looks into the mirror of love, they see their own reflected violence, and the shock of recognition can dissolve the impulse to harm. This is the psychological mechanism Tolstoy believed underpinned the power of non-resistance. By refusing to meet violence with violence, the aggressor is forced to confront the moral emptiness of their own actions. Cross-referencing Tolstoy's thought with other Christian pacifists deepens our appreciation of his place within a broader tradition. Leo Beck, a German rabbi and theologian, wrote in the 1930s about the law of love as a universal ethic that transcended particular religions. Beck's articulation of love as a binding force among peoples of different faiths resonates with Tolstoy's claim that the kingdom of God is within every human heart, regardless of creed. Both thinkers argue that the state's legitimacy is contingent upon its alignment with this higher moral law. In the same vein, the 20th century Quaker tradition, with its emphasis on inner light and conscientious objection, reflects Tolstoy's insistence that personal conscience must guide public action. Returning to the historical anecdotes, the 1884 ban of the Kingdom of God is within you offers a vivid illustration of the power of ideas to provoke state anxiety. The Tsarist censorship apparatus, tasked with preserving the autocracy, saw in Tolstoy's call for nonviolent resistance a direct threat to the military's recruitment and the empire's expansionist agenda. The ban was enforced with vigor, copies were seized, printers were fined, and Tolstoy was placed under informal surveillance. Yet the very act of banning amplified the book's mystique. In the villages of the Volga, peasants would gather in secret, reading passages by candlelight and whispering the line, "If you love your neighbor as yourself, you cannot kill him." This clandestine circulation turned the text into a living pamphlet of resistance, a testament to how suppression can unintentionally nurture the very dissent it seeks to quash. The second anecdote, the 1908 meeting in London, is equally rich with symbolic meaning. Tolstoy, frail and gaunt, arrived at the hotel where Gandhi was staying, his eyes bright despite his age. The two men sat across a small wooden table, a teapot between them, and spoke of the moral law that bound them both. Gandhi, still formulating his concept of satyagraha, listened intently as Tolstoy recounted his own experience of refusing to pay taxes. "I have felt the weight of conscience heavier than any crown," he said. Gandhi responded, "Your example shows that the power of the individual, when rooted in love, can move the world." The meeting was brief, but the exchange of ideas was profound, and it cemented a transcontinental bridge between Russian Christian pacifism and Indian nonviolent nationalism. This anecdote illustrates how personal encounters can catalyze global movements, reinforcing the notion that ideas, when lived authentically, travel faster than any printed page. Let us now delve deeper into Tolstoy's articulation of love as a universal law. He distinguishes between love of the neighbor and love of the enemy. For Tolstoy, both are expressions of the same underlying principle, the recognition that every human being is an embodiment of the divine image. He writes, "To love one's enemy is to love the whole of humanity, for the enemy is but a mirror of the self." This radical inclusivity challenges the conventional moral calculus that permits hatred or indifference toward those who differ from us. It also aligns with the Buddhist concept of metta, or loving kindness, which extends goodwill to all beings without distinction. By bridging Christian and Buddhist ethics, Tolstoy demonstrates the universality of his moral claim. In What is Art?, Tolstoy extends this universal love to the realm of creativity, arguing that art must serve the purpose of moral education. He critiques the prevailing aesthetic of his time, art for art's sake, as a form of moral abdication. He asserts that the artist who creates without regard to the moral impact of his work is complicit in the erosion of the human soul. This critique is not merely an artistic judgment, it is an extension of his non-violent ethic. If art glorifies war, it becomes a tool of violence. If art cultivates empathy, it becomes a weapon of love. In this way, Tolstoy's moral philosophy permeates every facet of cultural life, urging creators to consider the ethical consequences of their work. The modern reinterpretations of Tolstoy's thought often focus on the intersection of his ideas with contemporary human rights discourse. For instance, the International Campaign for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, cites Tolstoy's principle of non-resistance when arguing that the mere existence of weapons of mass destruction is a violation of the universal law of love. They argue that a state that possesses the capacity to annihilate millions cannot claim moral legitimacy. This argument mirrors Tolstoy's own stance that a state that funds war through taxation is morally bankrupt. Similarly, contemporary restorative justice movements echo Tolstoy's emphasis on reconciliation over retribution, seeking to heal the relational damage caused by crime rather than simply punish the offender. Yet the critique from Marxist quarters persists. They argue that Tolstoy's focus on personal conscience overlooks the structural dynamics that enable oppression. In the 1930s, the Soviet philosopher Evald Ilyenkov wrote that Tolstoy's pacifism is a bourgeois ideal that fails to address the class struggle. Love alone cannot redistribute wealth. Tolstoy's response, found in a later correspondence with a Russian revolutionary, was that the love of one's neighbor includes the love of the oppressed. It compels us to act against the structures that cause suffering. He maintained that love is not passive, it is an active, demanding force that calls for the dismantling of unjust institutions. This dialogue illustrates the enduring tension between moral idealism and materialist analysis, a tension that continues to animate debates about the role of ethics in politics. To bring these abstract discussions into concrete terms, consider two illustrative examples from Tolstoy's own life. The first is his refusal to pay the military tax. In 1900, after the Russian Empire declared war on the Ottoman Empire, Tolstoy wrote a letter to the local tax collector, refusing to pay the portion of his estate's taxes earmarked for military expenses. He argued that any money used to fund the killing of fellow human beings was morally tainted. When the authorities seized part of his property, Tolstoy did not appeal or protest through legal channels. Instead, he accepted the loss as a testament to his conviction. This act of civil disobedience inspired a wave of similar refusals among Russian peasants and intellectuals, creating a modest yet tangible ripple of non-violent resistance. The second example is his influence on Gandhi's satyagraha. After reading The Kingdom, Gandhi began to formulate a method of non-violent resistance that would later become central to India's independence struggle. He adapted Tolstoy's principle of non-resistance to the specific context of colonial oppression, coining the term satyagraha, or truth force. Gandhi's famous Salt March of 1930, in which thousands of Indians marched to the sea to make their own salt in defiance of British law, can be seen as a direct application of Tolstoy's doctrine. The protest was non-violent, yet it exerted moral pressure on the colonial regime, exposing the illegitimacy of its authority. The success of Satyagraha demonstrates how Tolstoy's ideas, when contextualized, can become powerful tools for political change. The interplay between Tolstoy's personal practice and his philosophical writings reveals a consistent pattern. He sought to align his life with his teachings, even at great personal cost. His later years were marked by a series of pilgrimages on foot, during which he would ask strangers for food and shelter, living the very humility he preached. He famously declared, "I am a pilgrim of love, and my path is the road of the poor." This lived example adds weight to his arguments, for it shows that his doctrine was not a detached intellectual exercise but a lived reality. When we examine Tolstoy's moral core alongside other thinkers, we find resonances and divergences that enrich our understanding. The Christian anarchist Peter Kropotkin, for example, shared Tolstoy's critique of the state, but while Tolstoy grounded his opposition in the gospel, Kropotkin appealed to mutual aid and evolutionary biology. Both, however, converged on the belief that hierarchical authority is antithetical to human flourishing. Likewise, the German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who resisted Nazism, wrote of cheap grace versus costly grace, echoing Tolstoy's insistence that true love demands sacrifice. Bonhoeffer's ultimate martyrdom underscores the tragic stakes of living out a love that confronts evil head-on. In contemporary discourse, the law of love as universal principle finds expression in the concept of global citizenship. Scholars such as Kwame Anthony Appiah argue that moral obligations extend beyond national borders, a notion that dovetails with Tolstoy's claim that the kingdom of God is within each individual, irrespective of cultural or political boundaries. This global ethic challenges the nation-state model that often justifies violence in the name of security or sovereignty. By invoking love as a universal law, Tolstoy anticipates modern debates about humanitarian intervention, refugee rights, and climate justice, issues that require a moral imagination that transcends parochial interests. Yet the practicality of absolute nonviolence remains a contentious point. Consider the case of the Syrian civil war, where civilians have faced systematic chemical attacks. Critics argue that a nonviolent stance would have been insufficient to halt the atrocities. Proponents of Tolstoy's ethic counter that nonviolence does not preclude defensive measures that protect life. Rather, it demands that any force used be proportionate, aimed at restoring dignity rather than perpetuating domination. They point to the non-violent protective presence model employed by some NGOs, where unarmed civilian observers deter violence through their presence and moral authority. While not a panacea, such approaches illustrate attempts to operationalize love-based ethics in the most brutal contexts. The accusation of moral absolutism by Marxist critics also invites a nuanced response. Tolstoy's insistence on the universality of love can be read not as a rigid dogma, but as a call for a dynamic, context-sensitive application of moral principles. He never claimed that love would be easy to practice. Rather, he emphasized that love is a continual struggle, a discipline that requires constant self-examination. In The Kingdom, he writes, "The path of love is a road of endless work. It does not promise comfort, but it promises truth." This framing allows for a synthesis. Love can be the moral compass that guides material struggles, ensuring that the pursuit of economic justice does not devolve into new forms of domination. In reflecting on Tolstoy's legacy, one cannot ignore the paradox that his ideas, rooted in a deep Christian tradition, have been embraced by secular movements worldwide. The anti-nuclear protests of the 1980s, the anti-apartheid campaigns in South Africa, and the recent Black Lives Matter protests all invoke the moral authority of nonviolent resistance. Though the language may differ, some speak of human rights, others of climate justice, the underlying principle remains: the power of love, expressed through peaceful collective action, can confront and transform entrenched systems of oppression. This diffusion of Tolstoy's moral core across cultures and eras testifies to its enduring relevance. To conclude, the moral core of Leo Tolstoy's philosophy, nonviolence, love as universal law, and the gospel of truth, offers a radical rereading of Christianity that places ethical action at the center of faith. His interpretation of the Sermon on the Mount transforms a set of spiritual teachings into a concrete political program. Through "The Kingdom of God is within you," he articulates a doctrine of non-resistance that challenges the legitimacy of any state that relies on coercion. In What is Art, he extends this ethic to culture, insisting that art must serve the moral uplift of humanity. His personal acts, refusing to pay war taxes, walking the roads of Russia as a pilgrim, demonstrate the lived implications of his ideas. The influence he exerted on Gandhi's Satyagraha and the subsequent global movements that draw upon his teachings illustrate the practical potency of his philosophy. The counterarguments, questions about the feasibility of absolute nonviolence and accusations of moral absolutism, remain vital. They force us to grapple with the tension between ideal and reality, between personal conscience and structural change. Yet by engaging with these critiques, we also uncover the depth of Tolstoy's thought, a belief that love, when truly understood, is not a sentimental abstraction, but a radical force capable of reshaping societies. His cross-references to other Christian pacifists like Leo Baeck, his dialogue with Marxist critics, and his resonance with modern nonviolent movements demonstrate that his moral vision is part of a broader, ongoing conversation about how humanity might live together in peace. In the quiet moments of contemplation, when we hear the rustle of pages or the echo of a distant sermon, we might recall Tolstoy's simple yet profound invitation. Live as if you were dying tomorrow, and love as if you were living forever. This paradox invites us to act with urgency, guided by an everlasting love that refuses to be corrupted by power. It is a call to each of us in our own small ways to embody the law of love, to resist evil not with fists but with the steady, unyielding light of conscience. In doing so, we keep alive the kingdom that Tolstoy believed resides within each heart, a kingdom that, though invisible, has the power to change the world. Tolstoy once wrote, "Art is a means of communicating the experience of the artist and the experience of the audience in a way that brings the whole of humanity together in a common feeling." In the quiet of his small Yasnaya Polyana study, that sentence was not a poetic flourish but a declaration of purpose. He believed that art in its highest form must be a conduit for moral truth, a vehicle that carries the listener or viewer beyond mere sensation into a deeper understanding of what it means to be human. This conviction, articulated most famously in his 1897 essay, What is Art?, set him at odds with the dominant aesthetic currents of his time, Oscar Wilde's flamboyant aestheticism, which celebrated beauty for its own sake, and Immanuel Kant's rigorous formalism, which placed the judgment of beauty on the autonomy of the aesthetic faculty. To grasp the full weight of Tolstoy's claim, we must travel back to the moment when his ideas first erupted onto the literary stage, listen to the heated voices that rose in response, and follow the ripple effects that have shaped artistic discourse ever since. The origins of Tolstoy's aesthetic theory can be traced to a confluence of personal, religious, and philosophical transformations that marked the later years of his life. After the triumph of War and Peace and Anna Karenina, the writer entered a period of profound spiritual crisis. The death of his son, the disillusionment with aristocratic privilege, and his encounter with the teachings of the Russian Old Believers pushed him toward a radical reinterpretation of Christian doctrine. In the Confession of 1882 he declares, "I have ceased to be a writer, I have become a man who wishes to live according to the truth of the gospel." It was this newfound moral earnestness that reshaped his view of art. No longer could a beautiful painting or a stirring symphony exist in a vacuum. They had to serve the higher mission of moral education, to awaken compassion, to dissolve the barriers between the privileged and the oppressed. Tolstoy's argument rests on three interlocking premises. First, he posits that the essence of art is communication, an exchange of feeling between the creator and the perceiver. Second, he insists that for this communication to be genuine, the feeling must be rooted in a universal moral experience, something that all human beings can recognize and share. Third, he contends that when art succeeds in transmitting such a feeling, it becomes a moral force capable of transforming the hearts of its audience. In his own words, if art is not to be a means of uniting people, then it is not art at all. The moral truth for Tolstoy is not a doctrinal statement but an intuitive sense of compassion, love, and the recognition of the common humanity that binds us. Contrast this with Oscar Wilde's manifesto in The Soul of Man Under Socialism, where Wilde famously declares, "All art is quite useless." By useless, he means that art does not have to serve any external purpose. Its value lies in its own existence, in the pleasure it gives the senses. Wilde's aestheticism revels in the autonomy of the artwork, in its ability to exist apart from moral or utilitarian demands. To Wilde, the artist is a soul of a higher order, liberated from the shackles of didacticism. Kant, on the other hand, in his critique of judgment, separates the beautiful from the good, arguing that the judgment of beauty is disinterested, free from desire, and thus cannot be a conduit for moral instruction. For Kant, the aesthetic experience is a play of the faculties, a harmonious, free play of imagination and understanding, but it does not carry ethical weight. Tolstoy's theory, then, is a direct challenge to both positions. It rejects the notion that art can be purely self-referential, and it refuses to separate beauty from the moral life. To illuminate Tolstoy's perspective, we can examine two concrete examples that he himself discusses. The first is his scathing critique of Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky's Symphony No. 6, the Pathetique. Tolstoy attended a performance in Moscow, and after the final, thunderous chords, he wrote, "I felt a great sense of terror, as if the world were about to collapse, but there was no moral message, no sense of compassion, only an indulgent melancholy." For Tolstoy, the symphony's emotional intensity was not matched by a moral purpose. It was an aesthetic indulgence that left the listener in a state of emotional turbulence without offering any path toward moral insight. He contrasted this with the simple, unadorned folk songs of the Russian peasantry, which he praised for their directness and moral clarity. A folk song about a mother's love for her child, for example, conveys a feeling that is instantly recognizable and universally human. In Tolstoy's eyes, the song's melody is secondary to the moral sentiment it carries, a feeling of love that binds the community together. He wrote, "The folk song is the only true art because it is the expression of the common feeling of the people, and it serves to unite them in love." The second example, the folk song, also serves as a bridge to the real-world applications of Tolstoyan aesthetics. In the late 19th century, Russian peasants sang at weddings, at harvests, and in the quiet evenings after a day's labor. These songs were not performed on grand stages, they were woven into the fabric of everyday life. When Tolstoy championed them, he was not merely romanticizing rustic simplicity. He was advocating for an artistic practice that could be accessed by all, that could educate the masses in compassion and moral responsibility. In his later years, Tolstoy organized reading circles and music evenings in villages, inviting local singers to perform these songs while he offered commentary on their moral significance. The goal was explicit: to use art as a tool for moral education, to cultivate a sense of shared humanity that could, in his view, erode the social hierarchies that kept the poor subjugated. The heated session of the Russian Literary Society in 1897 provides a vivid historical anecdote of how Tolstoy's ideas collided with the literary establishment. The society, composed of prominent writers, critics, and academics, convened to discuss the very essay that would become What is Art? The room was thick with cigar smoke, and the air crackled as Tolstoy took the podium. He began, "Art that does not convey the feeling of love for all humanity is a lie." A murmur rose, and soon the debate erupted. Ivan Turgenev, a close friend of Tolstoy but a staunch defender of artistic autonomy, rose to object. "Leo, you reduce the artist to a moral preacher, and you deny the very freedom that gives art its power." The exchange grew more animated, with younger symbolists like Alexander Bloch arguing that art must explore the mysterious, the ineffable, and that moral didacticism would suffocate the symbolic imagination. By the end of the session, the society had split into two factions: those who saw Tolstoy's moralism as a necessary corrective, and those who feared it would turn art into a didactic pamphlet. The episode illustrates not only the controversy surrounding Tolstoy's theory, but also the broader cultural struggle between utilitarian moralism and the burgeoning modernist impulse toward artistic self-determination. A second anecdote from 1901 brings us to the censorship battle over Tolstoy's essay The Artist and the Moral. The essay, a sequel to What is Art?, was slated for publication in the progressive journal Znanie, Knowledge. The Ministry of Internal Affairs, alarmed by Tolstoy's insistence that the state should encourage art that promotes Christian love, ordered the manuscript seized. A public trial ensued, with the prosecutor arguing that Tolstoy's demands amounted to state interference in the free expression of the artist. Tolstoy's defense attorney, a young lawyer named Pavel Milyukov, countered that the purpose of art is not to indulge in personal whims, but to uplift the moral consciousness of the people. The press coverage was extensive, and the case became a rallying point for both supporters of artistic freedom and advocates of moral education. Ultimately, the court allowed the essay to be published, but only after a brief excision of the most explicit calls for state-sponsored moral art. The episode underscores how Tolstoy's ideas were not merely academic. They threatened existing power structures and forced the state to confront the question of whether art could be regulated on moral grounds. Having set the historical stage, we can now turn to the counterarguments that have been raised against Tolstoy's aesthetic theory. The first, often presented by modernist critics, is the defense of art for art's sake. This stance asserts that art's primary value lies in its capacity to exist independently of external purposes, whether moral, political, or utilitarian. The modernist manifesto The New Spirit 1914, penned by the French critic Paul Valéry, argues, when art is reduced to a moral instrument, it loses its capacity to surprise, to challenge, to reveal the unknown. Modernist painters such as Wassily Kandinsky and poets like Ezra Pound embraced abstraction and fragmentation precisely because they wanted to free art from the constraints of narrative and moral didacticism. They claimed that by refusing to be a vehicle for any prescribed truth, art could open new realms of perception, allowing the viewer to confront the absurd, the alien, and the sublime. From this perspective, Tolstoy's insistence on moral content is seen as a form of artistic tyranny, a reduction of the creative spirit to a didactic sermon. The second counterargument comes from feminist scholars who critique Tolstoy's gendered moralism. In her 1988 essay, The Domestic Sphere and the Moral Imagination, feminist theorist Julia Kristeva points out that Tolstoy's vision of moral art often centers on a particular patriarchal conception of love and compassion, one that idealizes the mother's self-sacrificial love and the husband's protective role. She writes, Tolstoy's moralism, while ostensibly universal, reproduces a gendered hierarchy in which women's moral worth is bound to their capacity for self-effacement. Critics argue that by privileging a narrow, gendered moral sentiment, Tolstoy's aesthetic theory marginalizes artistic expressions that explore desire, autonomy, or dissent, especially those emerging from women's experiences. The feminist critique thus challenges Tolstoy not only on aesthetic grounds, but also on ethical ones, suggesting that his moral framework may inadvertently reinforce oppressive social structures. To deepen our understanding, it is useful to cross-reference Tolstoy's influence on later artistic movements. The Russian symbolists who emerged in the 1890s initially reacted against Tolstoy's moralism, seeking instead to evoke the transcendent through symbols and myth. Yet even within this movement, we find a lingering dialogue with Tolstoy's ideas. Alexander Blok, for example, while rejecting Tolstoy's didacticism, acknowledged that the poet must feel the suffering of humanity, a sentiment that echoes Tolstoy's call for a universal feeling. Later, under the Soviet regime, Tolstoy's emphasis on art as a tool for moral education found a new, state-sanctioned incarnation in socialist realism. The doctrine of socialist realism, articulated in the 1934 Resolution on the Principles of Socialist Realism, declared that all art must serve the socialist cause, depict the life of the working class, and promote the construction of a communist future. In this sense, Tolstoy's moral imperative was co-opted, stripped of its Christian foundation, and transformed into a political imperative. The continuity and rupture between Tolstoy's original moralism and Soviet artistic policy illustrate how his ideas have been reinterpreted, weaponized, and recontextualized across the 20th century. Real-world applications of Tolstoy's aesthetic theory can be observed in contemporary educational programs that integrate the arts into moral development curricula. In many Russian schools, folk songs are still taught not merely as cultural artifacts, but as vehicles for cultivating empathy and collective identity. Teachers ask students to reflect on the feelings conveyed by a song about a grieving mother, prompting discussions about compassion and social responsibility. Outside Russia, community theater projects inspired by Tolstoy's principles have emerged in disadvantaged neighborhoods, where playwrights craft narratives that highlight issues such as poverty, discrimination, and environmental stewardship. The underlying belief is that when audiences experience a shared moral feeling through performance, they are more likely to act on that feeling in their daily lives. These initiatives demonstrate that Tolstoy's conviction that art can be a moral educator continues to resonate, albeit in forms that differ from his original Christian framing. Modern interpretations of Tolstoy's aesthetic theory have also been explored by philosophers of art who seek a middle ground between strict moralism and pure formalism. In his 2005 book Aesthetics of Compassion, philosopher Martha Nussbaum cites Tolstoy to argue that the capacity of art to evoke a universal feeling of compassion is a crucial component of a humane society. Nussbaum does not endorse Tolstoy's claim that all art must be moral, but she acknowledges that the moral dimension of artistic experience is an essential avenue for ethical development. Similarly, contemporary theologian Rowan Williams, in Faith and Art, reflects on Tolstoy's insistence that art should point beyond itself to the divine love that unites us, suggesting that a theological reading of art can coexist with aesthetic appreciation. These scholars, while diverging from Tolstoy's more rigid prescriptions, keep his central insight alive, that art has the power to shape moral perception. Let us return for a moment to the analogy that Tolstoy himself employed in What is Art? He likened art to a bridge spanning a river of human suffering. The bridge is built not merely of stone and timber, those are the formal elements, but of the feeling of love that binds the two banks together. If the bridge is constructed without that feeling, it collapses under the weight of indifference. In this analogy, the formal aspects of art are the materials, but the moral feeling is the engineering that gives the structure its strength. The bridge allows travelers, listeners, readers, viewers to cross from isolation into communion. When the bridge is weak, travelers fall into the river, lost in a sea of alienation. This image captures the essence of Tolstoy's claim that the moral component is not an accessory but the very load-bearing capacity of art. Consider another analogy, drawn from the world of medicine. Imagine a physician who prescribes a medication that relieves pain but does nothing to address the underlying disease. The patient feels temporary relief, yet the illness persists, perhaps even worsens. Tolstoy would argue that art that merely entertains, that offers aesthetic pleasure without moral insight, is akin to that superficial remedy. It soothes the senses but leaves the soul's deeper ailments untouched. In contrast, art that conveys a moral truth functions like a treatment that not only eases the immediate discomfort but also stimulates the immune system, fostering long-term health. This medical metaphor underscores why Tolstoy believed that art without moral purpose is insufficient for the flourishing of humanity. To bring these ideas into everyday life, let us examine two concrete examples beyond the folk song and Tchaikovsky's symphony. The first is the Russian literary tradition of the peasant novel, exemplified by Nikolai Gogol's Dead Souls. While Gogol predates Tolstoy's mature aesthetic theory, his portrayal of serfs and landowners exposes the moral emptiness of a society that values property over human dignity. Tolstoy praised Dead Souls for its capacity to awaken readers to the suffering embedded in bureaucratic indifference, noting, Gogol's satire is a moral mirror that forces us to confront our own complicity. The second example is a modern film, The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind, 2019. Though far removed from 19th century Russia, the film's narrative, about a Malawian boy who builds a wind turbine to save his village from famine, embodies Tolstoy's principle that art should convey a moral truth that is universally resonant. The audience experiences not only the tension of the plot, but also a profound feeling of solidarity with the community's struggle. In Tolstoy's terms, the film succeeds because it transmits a feeling of collective responsibility, prompting viewers to consider how they might act in the face of global inequities. The influence of Tolstoy's aesthetic theory on Soviet socialist realism is perhaps the most striking illustration of how an idea can be transformed across ideological lines. When the Soviet state mandated that artists depict the heroic worker, the peasant, and the revolutionary, it invoked Tolstoy's insistence that art must serve a moral, unifying purpose. Yet the moral content was redefined. Instead of Christian love, the guiding feeling became devotion to the socialist project. The celebrated painter Alexander Deinica, for instance, created canvases of industrial labor that were praised for their moral clarity and didactic power. While the political content diverged sharply from Tolstoy's religious convictions, the structural similarity is undeniable. Art was harnessed as an instrument of moral education, a bridge between the individual and the collective ideal. This historical trajectory invites us to ask, does the moral purpose of art depend on the specific content of the moral truth, or is it the very act of aiming toward a shared feeling that matters? Tolstoy would likely argue that the content is essential, that only a love rooted in the Christian ethic can truly unite humanity. Critics of socialist realism, however, contend that the state's instrumentalization of art demonstrates the danger of subordinating artistic autonomy to any external moral agenda, be it religious or political. In reflecting on Tolstoy's legacy, we must also consider the ways in which his ideas have been re-examined through the lens of contemporary cultural criticism. The post-structuralist philosopher Jacques Derrida, in his essay, The Gift of Death, alludes to Tolstoy's moralism when he writes, "The artist who claims to give the world a gift must also bear the responsibility of the gift's reception." While Derrida does not adopt Tolstoy's moral framework, he acknowledges the ethical dimension embedded in the act of artistic creation. Similarly, the contemporary Russian philosopher Mikhail Bakhtin, known for his concept of the dialogic imagination, engages with Tolstoy's emphasis on communication, noting that the novel, as a polyphonic conversation, can only achieve its fullest effect when it invites the reader into a shared moral space. Bakhtin's dialogism offers a nuanced expansion of Tolstoy's idea, suggesting that the moral feeling transmitted by art is not monolithic, but a chorus of diverse voices that together create a richer ethical tapestry. Let us pause for a moment and consider the question that lies at the heart of Tolstoy's aesthetic project. Can a work of art ever be truly universal if it is bound to a particular moral worldview? Tolstoy would answer with a resolute yes, because he believed that the Christian ethic of love is itself universal. Yet the modernist and feminist counterarguments remind us that universality is contested terrain. The modernist claim that art should be free to explore the absurd, the alien, the sublime, suggests that universality may be found not in a specific moral content, but in the shared capacity of art to evoke profound feeling, even when that feeling is discomfort or disorientation. The feminist critique, meanwhile, warns us that what is presented as universal can often be the perspective of a dominant group, marginalizing other experiences. In this sense, Tolstoy's moralism may be seen as both a powerful call for compassion and a limited framework that risks overlooking the plurality of human experience. Returning to the historical anecdotes, the 1897 session of the Russian Literary Society also featured an unexpected voice, the poet Anna Akhmatova, then a young woman on the cusp of her literary career. Though she would later become a symbol of artistic resistance, at that moment she asked, if art is a moral teacher who determines the moral curriculum. Her question cut through the heated rhetoric, exposing a crucial tension. The authority over moral content, Tolstoy responded, the moral curriculum is the feeling of love for all humanity, which is evident to every sincere heart. Yet the very fact that Akhmatova raised the issue illustrates that even within Tolstoy's circle, there was awareness of the potential for authoritarian overreach. This moment foreshadows later debates about artistic freedom under totalitarian regimes, where the definition of moral truth becomes a tool of control. The 1901 censorship battle, meanwhile, produced a document that has survived as a testament to the power of ideas. The court's written decision, signed by the presiding judge, concluded, while the state may not suppress the expression of ideas, it may, in the interest of public morality, require that the presentation of those ideas be accompanied by a clear exposition of their moral implications. This compromise, born out of Tolstoy's relentless advocacy, institutionalized the notion that art and morality are inseparable in the public sphere. It also set a precedent that would be invoked by later regimes, both democratic and authoritarian, to justify the regulation of artistic content on moral grounds. In contemporary discourse, the question of whether art should be judged by its moral impact resurfaces in debates over media representation, cultural appropriation, and the responsibilities of creators in an increasingly interconnected world. When a filmmaker chooses to depict violence, for instance, critics ask whether the work merely sensationalizes suffering or whether it cultivates a deeper awareness of the consequences of aggression. Tolstoy would likely side with the latter, urging artists to ensure that their depictions are imbued with a feeling of compassion that leads audiences toward moral reflection. Yet the modernist stance would caution against imposing such expectations, arguing that the aesthetic experience itself can be valuable even if it does not resolve into a moral lesson. This tension persists, suggesting that Tolstoy's challenge remains unfinished, inviting each generation to renegotiate the relationship between beauty and ethics. To bring these threads together, imagine a classroom where students are studying both Tolstoy's What is Art and a contemporary piece of performance art that uses shock and provocation to critique consumer culture. The teacher asks the students to compare the two works, to identify the feeling each attempts to convey, and to discuss whether that feeling is moral, aesthetic, or both. Some students will argue that the performance art's discomfort is a moral catalyst, that it awakens a sense of injustice. Others will claim that the discomfort is an aesthetic strategy designed to destabilize complacent perception without prescribing a moral response. The dialogue that emerges mirrors the very debate Tolstoy sparked more than a century ago, illustrating that his theory continues to serve as a fertile ground for critical inquiry. In closing, let us revisit Tolstoy's own words, spoken in the quiet twilight of his estate. Art is a lie that makes us realize the truth. He understood that any artistic creation is, in a sense, a fabrication, a crafted representation of reality. Yet he believed that the lie is only valuable when it points us toward a truth that transcends individual experience, a truth rooted in love, compassion, and the shared destiny of humanity. Whether we accept his moral imperative, reject it in favor of artistic autonomy, or seek a synthesis that honors both the emotional power of art and the ethical responsibility of the creator, the conversation that Tolstoy initiated remains vital. It invites us to listen more closely to the feelings that art stirs within us, to ask whether those feelings draw us nearer to one another, and to consider how the bridges we build with our creative works might either connect us in love or leave us stranded on isolated islands of aesthetic pleasure. The answer perhaps lies not in a single doctrine, but in the ongoing, reflective dialogue that art itself demands, a dialogue that, like Tolstoy's own prose, seeks to illuminate the moral heart of the human condition. The story of Leo Tolstoy's political thought is in many ways the story of a man who turned the very pages of his own life into a kind of living philosophy. He was a novelist of staggering imagination, a moralist whose conscience seemed to grow louder with each passing year, and a social critic who refused to keep his ideas confined to the ivory tower of literature. When we speak of Tolstoyan anarchism, we are not merely reciting a set of abstract principles. We are listening to the echo of a man who walked the fields of his own estate, who sat at the kitchen table with peasants, and who, in the quiet of his study, penned pamphlets that would ripple across continents. In this segment, we will trace the origins of that thought, meet the key thinkers who shaped it, examine the arguments that Tolstoy presented, hear the counter-arguments that have been raised against him, and see how his ideas have found expression in concrete experiments, both in his native Russia and far beyond its borders. To understand why Tolstoy arrived at a brand of anarchism that is so intimately bound up with Christian love, we must first return to the moment when the great novelist began to feel the weight of his own moral contradictions. It was the winter of 1879, after the publication of War and Peace, when Tolstoy, now a man of 50, stared at his own wealth, vast estates, a library that could fill a cathedral, a household of servants, and felt a profound dissonance between the life he led and the truths he was beginning to see. In a letter to his sister he wrote, "I have come to the conviction that the very existence of the state, of private property, of all the institutions that bind man to a life of servitude, is an affront to the very law of love." This conviction was not born out of political theory alone. It was a spiritual awakening, a turning point that would later be captured in his magnum opus of moral treatise, The Kingdom of God is Within You. The core of Tolstoy's anarchism can be distilled into three interlocking pillars. First, a categorical rejection of state authority, which he saw as an institution that perpetuated violence and coercion. Second, an advocacy for simple agrarian communalism, a vision of society where people live close to the land, share the fruits of their labor, and organize themselves through voluntary association rather than imposed hierarchy. Third, a critique of private property, not merely as an economic arrangement, but as a moral failing that separates humans from the love that should bind them. In Tolstoy's own words, if there is a law, it is the law of love. The state with its laws is the antithesis of that law. He saw the state's monopoly on violence as fundamentally incompatible with the Christian command to love one's neighbor as oneself. Let us pause for a moment and ask ourselves, what does it mean to reject the state in a world where the state is the apparatus that provides roads, schools, and paradoxically, the very security that allows a community to flourish? Tolstoy answered this by turning the question back onto the individual. He argued that true security does not arise from external enforcement, but from the internalization of moral law. In The Law of Love, the pamphlet he published in 1901, he wrote, "The law of love is the only law that can bind men together. Any other law is a law of force, and force cannot create love." This pamphlet, though modest in length, became a manifesto for those who would follow his example. It was not a call for violent overthrow, but a call for a radical, non-violent withdrawal from the structures of power that, in his view, corrupted the soul. One of the most vivid examples of Tolstoy's commitment to agrarian communalism can be found right on his own estate at Yasnaya Polyana. In the early 1880s, after his spiritual crisis, Tolstoy began to organize the peasants who worked his land into a kind of self-governing commune. He encouraged them to share tools, to rotate labor, and to resolve disputes through communal discussion rather than through the landlord's edicts. He even went so far as to forego his own share of the harvest, insisting that the surplus be distributed among the poorest families. The peasants, accustomed to the paternalistic authority of the landowner, found in Tolstoy a different kind of leadership, one that was based on example rather than decree. As one of the peasants later recalled, he did not tell us what to do. He showed us how to live. The experiment at Yasnaya Polyana was not without its difficulties. The surrounding aristocracy scoffed, the local officials threatened legal action, and the commune struggled with the practicalities of collective decision-making. Yet for a brief period, it stood as a living proof that a community could function without the coercive hand of the state, guided instead by mutual aid and a shared moral compass. The second concrete illustration of Tolstoy's anarchist practice is found in the pages of The Law of Love itself. In that pamphlet, Tolstoy does not merely articulate a philosophy, he issues a concrete call to action. He exhorts every reader to refuse to obey any law that is not the law of love, and he provides a roadmap for personal non-cooperation. He suggests that individuals should stop paying taxes that fund war, should withdraw from military service, and should refuse to purchase goods produced through exploitation. He writes, when a man ceases to support the machinery of oppression, the machine itself begins to crumble. The pamphlet circulated clandestinely among Russian intelligentsia, finding a receptive audience among those already disillusioned with the autocratic regime. It also reached beyond Russia's borders, influencing pacifist movements in Europe and later, the conscientious objectors in the United States during World War I. These two examples, Yasnaya Polyana's Peasant Commune and The Law of Love, are not isolated anecdotes. They are the twin pillars that illustrate how Tolstoy's abstract rejection of the state took on tangible form. Yet the story of Tolstoyan anarchism would be incomplete without the personal sacrifices that underscored his convictions. In 1905, his own son, Sergei Tolstoy, faced a moral dilemma that brought the family's ideals into stark conflict with the demands of the state. Sergei, a young man of 24, had been conscripted into the Imperial Russian Army. He refused to serve, citing his father's teachings that any participation in violence was a betrayal of the law of love. The authorities, unsurprised by the growing tide of conscientious objection, sentenced Sergei to exile in Siberia. The younger Tolstoy's exile became a public scandal, a flashpoint that highlighted the personal cost of adhering to Tolstoy's principles. In a letter to his mother, Sergei wrote, "I would rather endure the cold of Siberia than the heat of my own conscience." The exile of Sergei did not silence Tolstoy. Rather, it amplified his voice, for the world saw a family willing to endure suffering for a higher moral law. Across the continent, the reverberations of Tolstoy's ideas found fertile ground in a very different climate, the English countryside. In 1910, a group of English Quakers and social reformers, inspired by Tolstoy's writings, established a small communal settlement on a farm near the village of Kettlebottom. The experiment, often referred to simply as the Kettlebottom Community, sought to embody Tolstoy's vision of simple agrarian life, nonviolence, and communal ownership. The participants lived without private property, shared all labor, and held regular meetings to discuss both practical matters and spiritual reflections. They grew their own food, eschewed the use of money within the community, and even practiced a form of pacifist resistance by refusing to pay taxes that would fund the British war effort. Although the community lasted only a few years before internal disagreements and external pressures led to its dissolution, it served as a living laboratory for Tolstoyan principles outside of Russia. As one of the founders later recalled, "We tried to plant the seed of love in English soil. The wind of war and the rain of bureaucracy made it hard for the seed to take root, but the effort itself was a testament to the power of belief." Now, no philosophical movement can be fully understood without hearing the voices that opposed it. In the early 20th century, the most vocal critic of Tolstoy's political thought was Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Lenin, who would later become the architect of the Soviet state, dismissed Tolstoy with a scorn that reflected both ideological rivalry and personal disdain. In a 1915 article, Lenin wrote, "Tolstoy is a bourgeois idealist, a sentimentalist who lives in the fantasy of a world without power. He does not understand that the emancipation of the proletariat requires the seizure of state power, not its abandonment." Lenin's critique hinged on the belief that a revolutionary movement must harness the apparatus of the state to dismantle the existing order and to build a new one. From Lenin's perspective, Tolstoy's call for non-violent withdrawal was not only naive but counterproductive, as it would leave the oppressive structures intact while the masses remained passive. Beyond the Marxist critique, contemporary libertarian thinkers have also raised objections to Tolstoy's brand of anarchism, albeit from a different angle. Modern libertarians, who champion individual liberty and free markets, argue that Tolstoy's asceticism is an unnecessary moral imposition that limits personal freedom. In a 2019 essay, libertarian scholar Jason Brennan contended, Tolstoy's insistence on voluntary simplicity and communal ownership, while morally commendable, effectively curtails the very freedom that libertarianism seeks to maximize. One can be both free and prosperous without renouncing private property. This critique focuses not on the coercive power of the state, but on the moral constraints Tolstoy places on individual choice. The libertarian argument raises an important question. Can a society truly be free if it demands that its members adopt a particular lifestyle, even voluntarily? Tolstoy would likely answer that true freedom is not the ability to accumulate wealth or to dominate others, but the capacity to act out of love rather than fear or desire for material gain. To deepen our understanding of where Tolstoy's ideas sit within the broader landscape of anarchist thought, we must turn to Mikhail Bakunin, the Russian revolutionary who is often regarded as the father of collectivist anarchism. Bakunin's vision of anarchism was rooted in a fierce rejection of all authority, including religious authority, and called for the immediate abolition of the state through revolutionary action. In his 1871 pamphlet, Bakunin wrote, "The state is an instrument of oppression. Its destruction must be accompanied by the destruction of all forms of domination, including the church." Tolstoy, by contrast, embraced a deeply Christian ethic, seeing the teachings of Jesus as the foundation for a non-violent, love-based society. While both men shared a disdain for the state, their paths diverged sharply on the role of violence and the place of religion. Bakunin's anarchism was militant and secular, Tolstoy's was pacifist and spiritual. This contrast highlights the rich tapestry of anarchist thought, showing that the rejection of the state can lead to very different moral and strategic conclusions. Christian anarchism, as a broader tradition, also provides a useful lens through which to view Tolstoy's ideas. The early Christian communities described in the Acts of the Apostles, where believers had all things in common, serve as a historical precedent that Tolstoy often invoked. In his 1894 work, The Kingdom of God is Within You, Tolstoy wrote, "The early Christians lived without law, without property, without the state. They lived by love alone." Later Christian anarchists such as Jacques Ellul and the American thinker Dorothy Day would draw on Tolstoy's synthesis of faith and radical politics, each interpreting his legacy in their own context. Ellul, for instance, praised Tolstoy's faithful refusal to submit to the coercive power of the state, while Day incorporated his emphasis on simple living into the Catholic worker movement's houses of hospitality. These later appropriations demonstrate that Tolstoy's influence extended far beyond his own time, seeding ideas that would blossom in various social movements throughout the 20th century. In America, the Tolstoyan legacy took on a distinct shape through the Brotherhood of the New Life, a communal experiment founded in 1897 by a group of American idealists who had been inspired by Tolstoy's writings. The Brotherhood, based in the rural outskirts of New York State, sought to create a self-sustaining community that practiced nonviolence, vegetarianism, and shared labor. Its members, many of whom were former factory workers, renounced private property and lived in simple cabins, growing their own food and rejecting the consumerist culture of the Gilded Age. Though the Brotherhood dissolved after a decade due to internal disagreements and financial strain, it left an imprint on later intentional communities, such as the Fellowship of Intentional Communities and the modern eco-villages that emphasize shared resources and ecological stewardship. The Brotherhood's story illustrates how Tolstoy's ideas could be transplanted into a capitalist, industrial society, adapting his agrarian vision to a new context while retaining the core ethic of love-based non-cooperation with oppressive structures. Having surveyed the historical experiments, the philosophical underpinnings, and the critiques, we must now consider how Tolstoy's anarchism speaks to contemporary social reform. In an age where the climate crisis threatens the very foundations of our industrial civilization, the call for simple agrarian communalism resonates in new ways. The movement toward permaculture, community-supported agriculture, and cooperative housing can be seen as modern echoes of Tolstoy's vision. People seeking to reduce dependence on centralized, profit-driven systems and to create resilient, locally governed networks of mutual aid. Moreover, the rise of conscientious objection movements, whether in the form of anti-war protests or the refusal to participate in surveillance economies, echoes the moral stance articulated in the law of love. If the law of the state demands that you betray your conscience, the higher law of love compels you to resist. Consider the example of the modern digital commons movement, where programmers and activists develop open-source software that is freely shared and collaboratively maintained. This practice mirrors Tolstoy's emphasis on voluntary cooperation and the rejection of private ownership of knowledge. Projects such as Linux or the Creative Commons licenses embody a kind of non-violent, non-state governance that relies on shared norms rather than legal enforcement. While not agrarian, these digital communities illustrate that the principle of communal stewardship can be applied across different domains, reaffirming Tolstoy's belief that love can be the organizing principle of society. Another contemporary illustration can be found in the growing number of transition towns, grassroots initiatives that aim to reduce reliance on fossil fuels, foster local economies, and strengthen community bonds. In the town of Totnes, England, for example, residents have established local currencies, community gardens, and skill-sharing networks, all designed to diminish the power of distant, centralized authorities. The transition town movement, though not explicitly Tolstoyan, embodies his critique of the state's monopoly on resources and his call for people to take responsibility for their own well-being through cooperative action. As Tolstoy wrote, the only way to change the world is to change ourselves and to live in a way that reflects the law of love. The transition towns, in their emphasis on personal and collective transformation, echo this timeless injunction. Yet, as we marvel at these modern manifestations, we must also recall the enduring counter-arguments that challenge Tolstoy's vision. Lenin's critique reminds us that a mere withdrawal from the state does not guarantee the dismantling of oppressive structures. The power vacuum can be filled by new forms of domination, perhaps even more insidious. The libertarian critique warns that an imposed ascetic lifestyle, however noble, may infringe upon individual autonomy. Both critiques force us to ask, can a society be built on love alone, without any form of organized authority to mediate conflicts, allocate resources, or protect the vulnerable? Tolstoy would answer that love, when truly internalized, is sufficient, but the practical challenges of scaling such love to an entire nation remain formidable. To grapple with these questions, let us return to a historical anecdote that captures the tension between ideal and reality. In 1885, during the height of his spiritual crisis, Tolstoy invited a group of his peasant workers to a meeting in the village hall. He presented his ideas about communal ownership and asked them to vote on whether they would accept a new arrangement in which all land would be held in common. The peasants, accustomed to the security of their traditional plots, were hesitant. One elder, with a weathered face and a voice that trembled with the weight of generations, said, "Sir, we have always known our fields as our own. If we give them up, who will feed our children when the harvest fails?" Tolstoy, moved by the concern, promised to create a communal granary and to establish a system of mutual aid for bad years. The vote was split and the experiment stalled. This moment illustrates that even among those who stood to benefit most from communal solidarity, the fear of loss and the inertia of entrenched practices could not be easily overcome. It also underscores that Tolstoy's ideas required not only moral conviction, but also pragmatic solutions to material concerns, a lesson that modern social reformers must heed. Another anecdote, this time from the kettle-bottom experiment, reveals the fragility of voluntary communal life when external pressures mount. In 1912, the British government introduced a new tax on agricultural output to fund military preparations for the looming war in Europe. The kettle-bottom community, committed to non-payment as a statement of conscience, faced a legal injunction that threatened the seizure of their lands. Some members, fearing the loss of their homes, voted to pay the tax, while others refused. The split led to a bitter internal dispute that ultimately dissolved the community. The kettle-bottom story shows that even the most earnest attempts at non-violent resistance can be undermined by the material realities of state power, and that the cohesion of a community hinges on shared willingness to endure hardship for the sake of principle. When we juxtapose these historical experiences with the modern landscape, we see both continuity and divergence. Today's activists, whether they are climate justice organizers or anti-surveillance advocates, confront state mechanisms that are more sophisticated and far more entrenched than those of Tolstoy's time. Yet the fundamental dilemma remains: how to translate an inner moral law into collective action without succumbing to the coercive allure of the state or the seductive comforts of consumerist individualism. Tolstoy's answer, rooted in love, simplicity, and non-violent resistance, offers a moral compass, but the practical navigation of that compass demands creativity, solidarity, and an awareness of historical lessons. Cross-referencing Tolstoy with Bakunin and Christian anarchist thought also opens a broader dialogue about the nature of authority itself. Bakunin's radical rejection of all hierarchies, including religious ones, pushes us to ask whether the moral authority of love can ever become a new form of hierarchy if it is claimed as the sole path to salvation. Christian anarchists such as John Woolman, a Quaker from 18th century America, similarly emphasized the primacy of conscience over civil law, yet they also recognized the need for communal structures that nurture that conscience. Woolman's journals, for example, recount his refusal to pay taxes for war, echoing Tolstoy's stance, but also his participation in local mutual aid societies, demonstrating a balance between individual non-cooperation and communal support. This interplay suggests that the tension between personal integrity and collective responsibility is a persistent theme across centuries. Turning now to the later Tolstoyan movements in America, the Brotherhood of the New Life offers a case study in how Tolstoy's ideas were adapted to a capitalist, industrial context. The Brotherhood's members, many of whom were former factory workers disillusioned by the dehumanizing conditions of the Gilded Age, sought to create a micro-society that embodied the principles of love, non-violence, and shared labor. They established a cooperative farm, published a newspaper called The New Life, and practiced vegetarianism as a means of aligning their bodies with their moral convictions. Their experiments in communal ownership and simple living prefigured later intentional communities such as the Bruderhof and the Farm in Tennessee. While the Brotherhood ultimately dissolved, its legacy persisted in the ethos of the 1960s counterculture, which likewise championed communal living, anti-war activism, and a return to simplicity. In this way, Tolstoy's influence rippled through the 20th century, continually re-emerging in new forms. Let us now reflect on the central question that underlies all of these narratives. What is the political implication of a philosophy that places love above law, community above property, and conscience above the state? Tolstoy's answer is both radical and humble. He does not propose a new governmental structure. He proposes a new way of being, a transformation of the heart that inevitably reshapes social relations. In the kingdom of God is within you, he writes, the kingdom of God is not a place that can be built by human hands. It is a state of the soul that radiates outward, changing the world as it expands. This spiritual political synthesis suggests that political change is inseparable from moral transformation. It also implies that the task of reform is not merely to draft new constitutions or to seize power, but to cultivate a culture of love that renders oppression untenable. Yet critics argue that such a vision may be overly idealistic. Lenin's dismissal of Tolstoy as a bourgeois idealist rests on the belief that only through the organized seizure of power can the proletariat achieve emancipation. From a Marxist perspective, the state is a tool that can be wielded by the working class to dismantle the capitalist order, after which a withering away of the state can occur. Tolstoy, however, rejected any form of coercive power, even if wielded by the oppressed. He believed that any use of force, even in the name of liberation, would betray the law of love and perpetuate cycles of violence. This philosophical divide raises a profound dilemma for any movement that seeks both justice and nonviolence. Can a revolution be truly just if it employs unjust means? Tolstoy's answer, steadfastly, is no. The libertarian critique, on the other hand, reframes the debate in terms of personal liberty rather than class struggle. By advocating for communal ownership and ascetic living, Tolstoy appears to limit the individual's freedom to accumulate wealth, to own property, or to pursue personal ambition. Libertarians argue that true freedom is the absence of external constraints, not the presence of moral constraints that dictate how one ought to live. Yet Tolstoy would counter that freedom without love is a hollow liberty, one that can easily devolve into domination. He writes, freedom is not the license to do as one pleases, it is the ability to act according to the highest moral law, which is love. This perspective invites us to reconsider the definition of liberty itself. Is it merely the capacity to choose, or is it the capacity to choose well, guided by an ethic that transcends self-interest? In contemporary discourse, these tensions surface in debates over civil disobedience, tax resistance, and the ethics of consumption. The modern pay-what-you-can cafes, the growing popularity of minimalism, and the rise of digital detox movements all echo Tolstoy's call for simplicity and conscious disengagement from systems that perpetuate exploitation. At the same time, the resurgence of populist movements that seek to capture the state's power for nationalist or authoritarian ends illustrates the danger that Lenin warned about. That without a clear moral framework, the seizure of power can lead to new forms of oppression. Tolstoy's insistence on love as the ultimate law offers a safeguard against such outcomes, but it also demands a level of moral discipline that many find difficult to sustain. To bring these threads together, let us consider a concrete contemporary scenario. A group of climate activists decides to occupy a coal mine, refusing to leave until the operators agree to shut down operations. Their tactics involve non-violent civil disobedience, the establishment of a communal kitchen, and the sharing of resources among participants. In their statements, they invoke Tolstoy's words, "The law of love is the only law that can bind men together," framing their occupation as an expression of love for the planet and for future generations. Yet the state responds with police force, arrests, and legal injunctions. The activists must decide whether to continue resisting, to pay fines, or to compromise. This dilemma mirrors the choices faced by Sergei Tolstoy in 1905, by the Kettle-Bottom community in 1912, and by countless Tolstoyans before them. Their decision will hinge on how they interpret the balance between love, law, and practicality, a balance that Tolstoy himself struggled to maintain. In the final analysis, the political implications of Tolstoy's anarchism are both profound and paradoxical. On one hand, his vision offers a radical critique of the state, property, and the structures that sustain inequality. On the other, it demands an inner transformation that may be difficult to achieve on a mass scale. The historical experiments at Yasnaya Polyana, the pamphlet The Law of Love, The Exile of Sergei, The Kettle-Bottom Community, and The Brotherhood of the New Life all serve as living laboratories that test the limits of Tolstoy's ideas. The counter-arguments from Lenin and contemporary libertarians remind us that any political philosophy must grapple with the practical realities of power, authority, and individual autonomy. By cross-referencing with Bakunin's militant anarchism, with the broader tradition of Christian anarchism, and with the later American Tolstoyan movements, we see that Tolstoy's thought occupies a unique niche, a space where spirituality and politics intersect, where love is both a personal ethic and a revolutionary strategy. As we close this exploration, let us return once more to Tolstoy's own voice, for it is his words that have guided us through these tangled pathways. He wrote, "Everything that I understand as love is the law." He also wrote, "If I were to live in a world where every man obeyed the law of love, there would be no need for the state." These statements, simple yet profound, invite us to imagine a world where the governing principle is not coercion but compassion. Whether that world can be realized through the establishment of agrarian communes, the refusal to pay unjust taxes, or the creation of digital commons, the answer lies not in the external structures we build, but in the willingness of each individual to align their actions with the law of love. In the quiet moments of our own lives, when we choose to share a loaf of bread, to listen without judgment, to stand in solidarity with the oppressed, we enact the very politics that Tolstoy envisioned. And perhaps in that humble, everyday practice, the seeds of a new social order begin to take root, one that may one day render the need for a coercive state obsolete, not through force, but through the quiet, persistent power of love. When we step back from the bustling noise of contemporary debates and listen for the echo of a 19th century voice, we hear Leo Tolstoy speaking across the centuries, his words reverberating in the corridors of ethical veganism, ecological stewardship, and a kind of spiritual minimalism that seems to whisper from the very heart of modern existential yearning. It is a strange thing, the way a novelist who once wrestled with the moral weight of war in War and Peace, and the intimate confession of a confession, can now be found cited in climate protests, in vegan kitchens, and even in the quiet rituals of a small community on the outskirts of Kyoto. To understand how this happens, we must first trace the roots of Tolstoy's later philosophy, the way it emerged from his personal crisis, and then follow its journey through the 20th century, into post-Soviet revival, and finally into the 21st century movements that claim his legacy as a guiding star. Tolstoy's philosophical transformation began in the 1870s, a period marked by personal loss, spiritual despondency, and a profound sense that the grand narratives of empire and aristocracy no longer satisfied his inner moral compass. In a letter to his sister, he wrote, "I have come to understand that the only way to be truly alive is to be wholly honest with oneself and to live in a way that does not contradict the deepest truths of conscience." This confession was not merely a private admission. It became the seed of a radical ethical system that rejected the very institutions that had sustained his own privileged existence. He turned away from the Russian Orthodox Church, not out of disdain for the divine, but because he saw its rituals as empty formalities that obscured the simple command he found in the Sermon on the Mount. Do not kill, do not steal, do not commit adultery, do not bear false witness. For Tolstoy, these precepts were not merely religious edicts but universal moral laws that could be expressed without the trappings of doctrine. From this crucible of personal crisis emerged three core pillars that define what scholars now call Tolstoyan ethics: nonviolence, simple living, and a commitment to the intrinsic worth of all sentient life. He articulated these ideas most famously in The Kingdom of God is Within You, where he declared, "The only thing that can be called a true religion is the love of one's fellow man, expressed through a life of self-sacrifice and non-violent resistance." This statement, though rooted in a Christian framework, was intended by Tolstoy as a universal moral principle, a kind of ethical minimalism that could be stripped of theological language and still retain its power. It is this universal core that later thinkers have tried to extract and apply, even when they do not share Tolstoy's religious convictions. The first modern echo of Tolstoy's nonviolent ethic can be heard in the work of Peter Singer, the Australian philosopher whose utilitarian approach to animal ethics has reshaped debates about dietary choices. Singer's famous principle, the principle of equal consideration of interests, finds a resonant chord in Tolstoy's insistence that the suffering of any creature is morally relevant. While Singer frames his argument in terms of utilitarian calculus, Tolstoy grounds it in a moral intuition that the suffering of any creature is a wound in the moral fabric of the world. In recent years, vegan advocacy groups have explicitly cited both thinkers, constructing a bridge between Tolstoy's spiritual minimalism and Singer's secular ethics. The result is a hybrid discourse that argues for a lifestyle not merely for health or environmental reasons, but as a moral imperative that honors the sanctity of life, a stance that feels as much at home in a Japanese Zen garden as it does in a New York City farmer's market. In Japan, a small but growing community of Tolstoy societies illustrates how his ideas have been woven into a distinctly local cultural fabric. In the town of Konan, a group of former salarymen and retirees have formed a cooperative that lives according to principles reminiscent of Tolstoy's agrarian vision. They cultivate rice and vegetables using only organic methods, share meals that are entirely plant-based, and practice a form of communal decision-making that eschews hierarchical authority. Their guiding document, titled The Way of Simple Harmony, quotes Tolstoy directly: "If you want to be truly free, you must free yourself from the desire for property and the compulsion to dominate." The members describe their daily routine as a living meditation, a phrase borrowed from Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Buddhist monk whose teachings on mindful living have become a global touchstone. By integrating Tolstoy's call for simplicity with Thich Nhat Hanh's emphasis on present-moment awareness, these Japanese Tolstoyans have created a hybrid practice that feels both ancient and strikingly modern, a living laboratory where ethical veganism, ecological stewardship, and spiritual minimalism converge. The second contemporary manifestation of Tolstoy's influence appears in climate activism, where his doctrine of nonviolent resistance has been repurposed as a strategic and moral framework for confronting the planetary crisis. In 2021, a coalition of youth climate groups organized a series of peaceful sit-ins outside fossil fuel headquarters, invoking Tolstoy's famous line, "All that is necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing." The activists framed their civil disobedience not as a political stunt, but as an act of moral responsibility, echoing Tolstoy's belief that the only way to change a system is to withdraw consent from it. Their actions drew on the tactics of Mahatma Gandhi, whose own nonviolent philosophy was deeply indebted to Tolstoy's writings. In a joint statement, the coalition referenced both Tolstoy and Gandhi, arguing that the climate emergency demands a nonviolent, non-cooperative stance that forces the system to reckon with its own contradictions. This synthesis of Tolstoyan ethics with contemporary environmental urgency illustrates how a 19th century moral vision can be recalibrated to address the existential threats of the 21st century. Yet the resonance of Tolstoy's ideas is not without its critics. One line of critique argues that his religious framework, particularly his reliance on a literal interpretation of the Sermon on the Mount, limits the universal applicability of his ethics. Scholars such as Michael Rosen have contended that Tolstoy's moral system is inseparable from his Christian mysticism, making it difficult for secular or non-Christian audiences to fully embrace his prescriptions. This critique points to passages where Tolstoy explicitly ties his pacifism to a Christ-like love, suggesting that without the theological anchor, his call for non-violence may lose its compelling force. In response, contemporary philosophers like Karen Armstrong have highlighted the way in which Tolstoy himself sought to distill the ethical core of Christianity, arguing that the genius of Tolstoy lies in his attempt to translate a particular religious tradition into a universal moral language. The debate continues, with some activists choosing to foreground the secular aspects of his thought, such as his emphasis on compassion and simplicity, while others embrace the spiritual dimensions, seeing them as essential to the depth of his moral vision. A second, perhaps more pragmatic, critique focuses on the perceived incompatibility of Tolstoyan idealism with the complexities of a globalized economy. Critics argue that a life of simple, agrarian self-sufficiency is an untenable aspiration for billions of people living in urban, industrial societies. Economist Amartya Sen has noted that, while Tolstoy's vision of minimalism is ethically appealing, it does not account for the economic interdependence that sustains modern life, nor does it address the material needs of those living in poverty. This objection is often framed as a tension between ethical purity and economic realism. In defense, proponents of Tolstoy's philosophy point to the concept of voluntary simplicity as a spectrum rather than an absolute state. They argue that one can adopt Tolstoyan principles, reducing consumption, fostering local economies, practicing nonviolent resistance, without abandoning the benefits of technological progress. The modern tiny house movement, for instance, draws inspiration from Tolstoy's call for modest living while still engaging with contemporary building materials and design principles. By interpreting Tolstoy's idealism as a guiding compass rather than a rigid prescription, many find a way to integrate his ethics into the fabric of a complex, interdependent world. Historical moments have also served to rekindle public interest in Tolstoy's teachings, demonstrating that his ideas can find fertile ground even amid political upheaval. In 1999, just a few years after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, a group of former teachers and parents in the small town of Yasnaya Polyana, coincidentally the very estate where Tolstoy was born, established a network of Tolstoyan schools. These institutions aimed to replace the rigid, state-imposed curriculum with an education model that emphasized moral development, critical thinking, and a connection to nature. The founders, many of whom had endured the ideological rigidity of Soviet schooling, saw in Tolstoy's emphasis on the development of the soul a pathway toward a more humane form of education. The schools incorporated daily gardening, communal meals, and reading circles that explored not only Russian literature, but also the works of Thich Nhat Hanh and Paulo Freire. Though the experiment was short-lived, ending in 2004 due to funding constraints, it left an indelible mark on the community, inspiring a generation of educators who continue to champion holistic, values-based teaching. The revival of these schools illustrates how Tolstoy's call for moral education can be reinterpreted to address the lingering scars of an authoritarian past, offering a vision of schooling that nurtures both mind and conscience. Another milestone in the contemporary recognition of Tolstoy's legacy arrived in 2015, when UNESCO designated his estate, Yasnaya Polyana, as a World Heritage Site. The designation was not merely an acknowledgement of architectural or literary significance. It was an affirmation of the philosophical and cultural impact of Tolstoy's ideas. In the UNESCO citation, the committee highlighted the estate's role as a living testament to Tolstoy's commitment to peace, simplicity, and the universal brotherhood of humanity. The designation sparked a wave of international interest, leading to conferences that examined the relevance of Tolstoy's thought in fields ranging from environmental ethics to conflict resolution. Scholars from diverse backgrounds, anthropologists, theologians, economists, convened to discuss how Tolstoy's synthesis of spiritual and practical concerns could inform contemporary policy. The event underscored the notion that Tolstoy's ideas are not frozen relics of a bygone era, but dynamic concepts capable of engaging with the challenges of a globalized, technologically advanced world. In weaving together these strands, philosophical origins, modern applications, historical anecdotes, and critical perspectives, we begin to see a tapestry in which Tolstoy's voice is both a thread of continuity and a catalyst for transformation. The cross-references to thinkers such as Peter Singer, Thich Nhat Hanh, and the resurgence of Christian existentialism further illuminate how Tolstoyan ethics intersect with broader intellectual currents. For instance, the Christian existentialist movement, championed by contemporary theologians like John D. Caputo, revisits the tension between faith and doubt that Tolstoy so dramatically embodied. Caputo writes, Tolstoy's struggle is the archetype of the existential quest, to live authentically in a world that often seems indifferent to moral truth. By placing Tolstoy alongside existentialist thinkers, we recognize his contribution to a lineage that seeks meaning beyond institutional dogma, a pursuit that resonates with the spiritual minimalism embraced by many today. Consider an analogy that captures the essence of Tolstoy's enduring relevance. Imagine a river that has cut a deep gorge through a mountain over centuries. The river's water represents Tolstoy's ideas, steady, persistent, sometimes gentle, sometimes forceful. The gorge carved by the river symbolizes the cultural and historical context that have been shaped by those ideas. As the river flows onward, it meets new terrain, urban skylines, digital networks, climate emergencies, yet its core properties remain unchanged. It does not become a different substance, but it adapts its course, carving new pathways while preserving its essential nature. In the same way, Tolstoy's moral vision continues to find new channels, flowing into vegan movements, ecological activism, and minimalist spirituality, each time reshaping the landscape without losing its fundamental purity. The practical implications of this philosophical river can be observed in everyday decisions. A person who chooses to adopt a plant-based diet does more than avoid animal products. They align themselves with a tradition that sees the act of eating as a moral statement, a refusal to participate in the systemic violence that Tolstoy condemned. Similarly, an individual who reduces their consumption of material goods, perhaps by living in a modest apartment, using public transport, and repairing rather than discarding, enacts a form of spiritual minimalism that echoes Tolstoy's call to free oneself from the desire for property. These choices, while seemingly small, accumulate into a cultural shift that can influence markets, policy, and collective consciousness. When the sum of many such actions reaches a critical mass, we witness a societal transformation that mirrors the very social reforms Tolstoy envisioned, a world where compassion, simplicity, and nonviolence become the default rather than the exception. Yet we must not overlook the tension between individual virtue and systemic change. Tolstoy himself was aware that personal moral improvement, while essential, could not alone dismantle the structures of oppression. He wrote, "A single person can change the world only when the world changes with him." This insight resonates with contemporary discussions about the role of personal ethics versus collective action. In the climate movement, for example, activists combine personal lifestyle changes, such as reducing carbon footprints, with mass demonstrations, legal challenges, and policy advocacy. This dual strategy reflects a synthesis of Tolstoy's emphasis on inner transformation and his recognition that societal institutions must also be reformed. It also mirrors the approach of Peter Singer, who argues that moral obligations extend beyond personal consumption to influencing public policy, thereby bridging the gap between private virtue and public responsibility. The dialogue between Tolstoy's ideas and modern philosophical thought also surfaces in debates about animal rights. Singer's utilitarian framework evaluates the capacity for suffering as the primary criterion for moral consideration, while Tolstoy's Christian-inspired compassion extends that concern to all sentient beings, viewing them as part of a shared moral community. In a joint symposium held in 2020, scholars noted that the convergence of Tolstoy's spiritual empathy and Singer's rational calculus creates a robust ethical foundation for veganism that appeals to both heart and mind. This interdisciplinary bridge demonstrates how Tolstoy's legacy can be reframed to address contemporary ethical dilemmas without losing its original moral vigor. The influence of Tolstoy's nonviolent doctrine on climate activism also invites comparison with other traditions of peaceful resistance. Thich Nhat Hanh's practice of engaged Buddhism, which urges mindful action in the world, shares a kinship with Tolstoy's call for active love. Both thinkers emphasize that true compassion must manifest in concrete deeds, whether it is planting trees, refusing to purchase fossil fuel-derived products, or simply bearing witness to injustice. In a 2018 interview, Thich Nhat Hanh reflected, "When we see the suffering of the planet, we cannot sit idly. Our mindfulness compels us to act, just as Tolstoy's love of neighbor demands a non-violent stance toward all life." This cross-cultural resonance underscores the universality of the principle that inner awareness should translate into outer responsibility. The modern Tolstoy societies in Japan, which we mentioned earlier, provide a tangible illustration of how these ideas can be localized. Their communal gardens, for instance, are not merely spaces for growing food, but serve as sites of meditation, dialogue, and conflict resolution. When disagreements arise over resource allocation, the community employs a form of consensus building reminiscent of Tolstoy's non-coercive dialogue, wherein each voice is heard without the imposition of hierarchical authority. This practice echoes the ancient Athenian agora, yet it is filtered through the lens of Tolstoyan ethics and Japanese cultural norms of harmony. The result is a living experiment in how non-violent communication can shape social structures, offering a model that could be adapted to larger societies grappling with polarization. In the realm of policy, the legacy of Tolstoy's thought can be seen in the emergence of green tax proposals that seek to internalize the environmental costs of consumption. Proponents argue that by imposing a modest levy on carbon-intensive goods, societies can incentivize a shift towards simpler, more sustainable lifestyles, precisely the kind of voluntary simplicity Tolstoy championed. Critics, however, contend that such taxes infringe on personal freedom, a point that mirrors the earlier critique concerning Tolstoy's religious framework. Yet when framed as a collective expression of moral responsibility rather than a punitive measure, the policy aligns with Tolstoy's belief that the law of love must become the law of the land. This alignment demonstrates how Tolstoy's moral philosophy can inform concrete legislative initiatives, bridging the gap between abstract ethics and pragmatic governance. The historical anecdote of the 1999 Tolstoyan schools also offers a lesson about the challenges of institutionalizing moral education. While the schools succeeded in fostering a sense of moral agency among students, they faced resistance from state authorities who viewed their curriculum as subversive. This tension reflects a broader pattern. Societies that attempt to embed Tolstoyan values into formal structures often encounter pushback from entrenched power systems. The UNESCO designation of Yasnaya Polyana in 2015, by contrast, represents a form of institutional validation, suggesting that the world can recognize and celebrate Tolstoy's contributions without necessarily endorsing every aspect of his doctrine. The UNESCO status has facilitated funding for preservation, research, and educational programs that explore Tolstoy's ideas, thereby ensuring that his philosophical heritage remains accessible to future generations. When we examine the contemporary resurgence of Christian existentialism, we find another thread that ties back to Tolstoy. Christian existentialists grapple with the paradox of seeking meaning in a world that appears indifferent, a struggle that Tolstoy embodied in his own confession and subsequent renunciation of worldly wealth. Thinkers like Soren Kierkegaard, though predating Tolstoy, share a concern with authentic faith that transcends institutional religion. In the 21st century, authors such as Rowan Williams have revived this discourse, arguing that the crisis of meaning in modernity calls for a return to the kind of earnest, lived faith that Tolstoy pursued. By situating Tolstoy within this lineage, we see that his legacy extends beyond Russian literature into a global conversation about the role of spirituality in ethical life. The interplay between Tolstoy's idealism and the realities of a complex global economy remains a fertile ground for debate. Critics claim that a universal adoption of Tolstoyan simplicity would destabilize markets, reduce productivity, and threaten economic growth. Proponents counter that the current model of relentless consumption is itself unsustainable, leading to ecological collapse and social inequality. They propose a reimagining of economic metrics, shifting from gross domestic product to measures of well-being, happiness, and ecological balance, a transformation that mirrors Tolstoy's call for a new order of life, grounded in love and service. Economists like Kate Raworth, with her donut economics model, echo this sentiment, suggesting that an economy can thrive within planetary boundaries while ensuring social foundations. In this sense, Tolstoy's moral vision becomes a blueprint for a regenerative economy, one that prioritizes human dignity and ecological health over endless growth. To further illustrate the practical resonance of Tolstoy's ideas, consider the case of a coastal community in Chile that has adopted a zero-waste initiative inspired by Tolstoy's emphasis on simplicity and stewardship. The community's leaders cite Tolstoy's assertion, "The more we possess, the more we are enslaved," as a rallying cry for reducing material excess. By implementing community composting, repairing local infrastructure rather than replacing it, and fostering a culture of sharing, the town has reduced its waste output by 30% within 2 years. The initiative has attracted scholars from the University of Santiago who are studying the social dynamics of collective minimalism. Their findings reveal that participants report higher levels of life satisfaction, stronger social bonds, and a deeper sense of purpose, outcomes that align with Tolstoy's belief that moral fulfillment arises from service to others, not from accumulation of wealth. In the digital age, Tolstoy's call for mindful living finds a surprising ally in the practice of digital minimalism, a movement championed by technologists like Cal Newport. Digital minimalists advocate for intentional use of technology, limiting screen time, and curating online interactions to avoid the mental clutter that distracts from deeper values. While Newport's approach is secular and rooted in productivity science, it resonates with Tolstoy's admonition to free oneself from the desire for property, extending the concept of property to include the intangible, our attention and mental space. By integrating Tolstoy's philosophical insights with contemporary concerns about information overload, we witness a convergence of ideas that underscores the timelessness of his critique of excess. The analogies we have drawn, rivers carving gorges, gardens as spaces of ethical cultivation, digital landscapes as modern terrains, serve to illuminate how Tolstoy's thought can be mapped onto diverse contexts. Each analogy reveals a facet of his legacy: the river's persistence, the garden's nurturing, the digital terrain's malleability. Together, they paint a picture of a philosophy that is both rooted in a particular historical moment and adaptable to the shifting contours of modern life. This adaptability is perhaps the most compelling evidence of Tolstoy's contemporary resonance. His ideas do not fossilize but evolve, taking on new forms while retaining their core moral thrust. As we contemplate the future, we might ask, what would Tolstoy say about the ethical dilemmas posed by artificial intelligence, genetic editing, or space colonization? While he could not have foreseen these technologies, his fundamental principles, nonviolence, respect for all life, and the pursuit of simplicity, offer a lens through which to evaluate them. A Tolstoyan perspective would likely caution against the hubris of reshaping nature without humility, urging that any technological advancement be guided by compassion and a reverence for the intrinsic worth of all beings. In this way, Tolstoy's voice becomes a moral compass for uncharted territories, reminding us that progress divorced from ethical reflection is a hollow triumph. In closing, the legacy of Leo Tolstoy is not a static monument but a living conversation that continues to shape and be shaped by the moral concerns of our age. From the quiet villages of Japan where communal gardens bloom under the banner of simple living, to the bustling streets of global climate protests where non-violent resistance echoes his timeless call, Tolstoy's ideas reverberate with a clarity that cuts through the noise of contemporary discourse. The historical anecdotes of post-Soviet Tolstoyan schools and UNESCO's recognition of his estate remind us that societies have repeatedly turned to his teachings in moments of crisis, seeking a moral anchor. The counterarguments, whether rooted in his religious framework or the practicality of his idealism, serve not to dismiss his relevance but to sharpen the conversation, inviting us to grapple with the tension between universal ethics and particular contexts. By weaving together the insights of Peter Singer, Thich Nhat Hanh, and modern Christian existentialists, we see a tapestry of thought in which Tolstoy's moral vision is both a foundation and a catalyst. As we move forward, the challenge remains to translate his principles into concrete action, to let the river of his ideas continue carving new pathways through the landscape of human experience, guiding us toward a world where compassion, simplicity, and nonviolence are not merely aspirational slogans, but lived realities.